Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of Annaghdown Heritage Society, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to our first talk of the autumn season. Now, I should probably introduce myself. I'm a Blowian, but I've been involved in the Heritage Society for a couple of years. My name is Jerry Morgan. I'm chairperson of the Society this year. Our talk tonight is going to be on migration of Irish families. First of all, I'd like to say it's a topic that's been suggested to us by Mary Newell. She brought it up first a few meetings ago. And ultimately, one of the goals of the Society will be to develop a project on families from the Currandullah and Annaghdown area who migrated to the east, particularly of the country. But tonight, it's not about that, but hopefully we learn and get some pointers on how to proceed. When we think of migration, we often think of people moving from modern day war, famine to Western Europe, to ourselves. Look at Ukraine and the problems we have. Perhaps for many of us across the country, our Irish ancestors emigrated across the world, and we know of some of the turmoil that developed with that. But we don't think of modern day emigration of Irish families much, but indeed, I think we learned tonight that in the period from about 1880, 100 years after that to 1980, over 1 million Irish people moved across the country. And it's a huge number. And indeed, families from Annaghdown moved to Meath. It's my pleasure to welcome Martin O'Halloran tonight, who's going to talk to us on the topic related to this. Everyone knows a land commission family. Martin's the son of a migrant family from Clonbur, who were resettled together with 23 other families in County Meath and Allenstown in 1940 by the Land Commission. And there were dual aims of redistribution of land on one hand and the hope of establishing an Irish-speaking community in Meath on the other hand. And I don't think that aspect was successful, but hopefully we'll find out about it. Martin's written about this. His first book, The Lost Gaeltacht, won an award in 2021 at the Heritage Society in Listowel Writers' Week. I managed to get a copy in Charlie Burns a few weeks ago, and Pat can certainly, she's read more of it than I have, and she can attest that it's an excellent, well-written book, well illustrated. And just as a little bit of publicity, Martin's kindly brought along some copies of it, which he'll sign and offer at the discounted price of €20 tonight. So we have a few if anybody is interested in that. But he's not just limited in himself to this. He's currently working on a second book, Seanachas Trishahan, a collection of stories, customs, old sayings and lore based on the Duchess 1937 Schools collection. And indeed a third book entitled Band of Cousins, which explores the diaspora descended from his great-great-great-grandparents on the shores of Lochs Mask and Carroll. So you can see that Martin has a passion for migration and family. Martin holds degrees from Trinity College Dublin and the University of London. He was Chief Executive of the Health and Safety Authority, a company director, and is currently President of the Institute of Public Administration and Chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee of the Department of Social Protection. He's passionate about lifelong learning and has a keen interest in migrations within Ireland, land resettlement, and the work of the Irish Land Commission and local history. And indeed, we're really fortunate and delighted to have Martin here tonight to talk. So without further ado, please.
Okay, is that okay? Yeah, brilliant. If you want to share your screen straight away, you can just let me know.
Yeah, you do.
I'll do that. Okay.
Okay, good evening. And thank you very much to Irene and the Heritage Society for inviting me to come here. If I talk a lot of blather, you can sort of pretend you don't hear that bit but I'm an accidental author, and it's thanks to Thomas Kine, who's here in the front row, who suggested I should write an article And then Tomas subsequently got us access to Land Commission records. So we went from writing based on the lived memory and interviews of people to actually having solid records to substantiate it, because the living memory and the interviews, they're super. But the mind, I find, or the memory can be a slightly fickle creature. And, you know, sometimes a fish is that size, but the memory remembers it that big. And a piece of land was an acre, and suddenly the memory has it was 1 acre, 1 rood and 2 perches. So the memory can be a little bit fickle. So without further ado, I'll just I call this, everyone knows, a Land Commission family, because when I was growing up, I didn't know there were families other than Land Commission families, because left of me, right of me, north, south, east and west, we're all Land Commission families, and that's all we knew. We didn't think of ourselves as Land Commission families. We were just the families in a place, but we had a common ancestry. And I actually found that when I went to school that and when I was brought on trips to Galway, I actually identified more with my Galway cousins than I did with the people locally, because Irish was the language of the household. When we came down here to Clonbar, I spoke Irish. It would seem natural, but we didn't speak it that much at school because we didn't go to a Gaelic school, and that's an altogether other story. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a refresher. Apologies now if I'm teaching to use the expression granny subject, but I'm just going to re-establish. So the land war started in 1879. The establishment of the Land League in October 1879 by Michael Davitt. And of course, we were all taught in school about the 3 F's: fair rent, free sale, and fixity of tenure. The Irish Land Commission was established as a rent fixing commission under the Ireland Land Law Act 1881, and was the second Irish Land Act passed by the Parliament of the United Kingdom in 1881. And it was an act to further amend the law relating to the occupation and ownership of land in Ireland and for other purposes relating to. But the Land Commission itself was established in 1843, but it was to look into and to study the land. But its particular remit around fixing rents, which was probably somewhat of a reaction to the land wars. The Congested District Board was established by Balfour, Chief Secretary, in 1891 to relieve poverty and congestion in the West and Northwest. And of course, some historians will argue that that was also a reaction because of the fear in Parliament in the UK about the trouble emerging in Ireland. And then we move on to what really is probably, I think, the most significant part, the 1923 Land Act. The third Dáil enacted this act and it was passed on the 9th of August 1923. It was very significant because it was probably the first major piece of legislation, other than what I call some finance bills and finance acts and things like that, that had to be done to keep the country going. But I think the first, second and third Dáil undoubtedly recognised the importance of the land question. So really this was the attempt at the land question. And it's really intriguing to read the Oireachtas debates on it, because while politically Ireland was fairly divided, there's no doubt that I'm trying to think of his name, I can't think of his name, but this act bill was navigated through the Oireachtas by a Galway TD, whose name escapes me at the moment, but I could guess it. So it was important, it was big, and it actually led to the abolition of the Congested District Board, or maybe put a different language on it, its integration into the new Land Commission. So its function, its records, everything was amalgamated and integrated into the Land Commission. Now, the Land Commission ceased active operation in the late 1980s. It was based in number 23 Upper Merrion Street, opposite the Leinster House. And it was actually, the dissolution started with the Land Commission Dissolution Bill 1989, but it took 3 years for that to actually get through the Houses of the Oireachtas and become enacted. However, it languished there, and it took another 7 years before they actually, what the term they used, commenced it, brought it actually into force. And interestingly, the Merrion Hotel, which now sits on the site of the Land Commission and 1 or 2 other government offices, opened in 1997. So in 1992, as soon as the act was passed, they immediately sold the properties opposite Leicester House for the for these. So I think I would argue that the Land Commission legacy, it's Ireland's greatest social experiment. It was internal migration on a massive scale over, well, either you could take it 100 years, but from the 1923 Land Act up to 1980, you're really talking about 6 decades of very active transfer of land. There are estimated to be more than 225,000 families impacted by the work of the Irish Land Commission. Now, this would equate to about 1.5 million people, having regard to the fact that families were probably 5 and 6. That would be typical average size, given the fact that there might be an old couple in a house, but in a village, you probably got average sizes. There were 8.5 to 11 million records created, and they're currently housed in a warehouse in Portlaoise. And of course, I would argue that's absolute terrible scandal. And there are some of us who are lobbying as best we can to have them digitized and made available, because I would argue that it's probably the single richest untapped archive in the country. It's actually richer than births, marriages and deaths. It's richer than war material. It's actually, and I'll show you some of the pieces that I took from it, I say with Thomas's intervention. And what I would say is that it's a closed archive, but it's publicly accessible through PRONI, the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland. So, and the world didn't stop turning when they made the records available. So there's no reason. It's argued that politicians are afraid that their dirty secrets are hidden in there. Look, what I found when I went through it, I found extensive evidence of lobbying. Look, every politician, every priest, every doctor, every councillor was lobbying. However, what I didn't see was that lobbying translating into corrupt practices. In other words, the inspectors kept a tight grip on it. And it reminds me one time of a TD. He was very smart. He must have been a Michael Healy-Rae type. But someone would walk up to him and say, Michael, did you sort out that little bit of problem for me, or the bit of land, or the hospital appointment? And he'd say, well, do you know what? I was just thinking of it. Well, see, it's here in my top pocket. He kept all the little notes in his top pocket, and no matter who he met, he had one to pull out. I was just thinking of you yesterday. So the inspectors were a little bit like that. They were lobbied, but they were pragmatic. So now I would say to you, you have to be very, very careful when you're looking at Land Commission records, because if you're looking from the English perspective, there'll be statute acres. If you're looking from the Irish perspective, there'll be Irish acres. If you're looking in modern days, it'll be square kilometers, millions of hectares, acres. So you just need to be careful what you're looking at. But just take the parish where I grew up. There were land distribution from the early 1900s. The Waller Estate first distributions took place in the early 1900s. And the last one that I'm aware of took place in the 1970s, which was the Tisdale Estate, where there was secondary distribution, because the economic holdings they got in the 1940s, by the 1970s, they were not economically viable. They got about 28 acres, but as saying goes, you would not rear a family of 8 or 10. And that's the typical size of families that were in Annaghdown. 3 or 4 would be a very small family. 7, 8, 10, and 12 would be more typical, not unlike a lot of families that they would have come from in the West. So in the parish of Bohermeen, there were Waller, Tisdale, Thompson, Law, Rowntree, Williams, Millions, Foster, Dias, Roberts, and Coddington, and they're all very colourful characters. You could name any one of those, and you'll find they'll appear in the newspaper columns for various good reasons, and not always such good reasons, but they're very colourful and they make for wonderful reading. If you want sex and drugs and rock and roll, don't be bothering with fiction. Just read the lives of some of these people. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this was a report published by the Land Commission for the period. So it says, report of the Land Commission, comprehensive and excellent report just issued by the Land Commission brings the statistics related to land purchase operations up to the end of March last. So it was for the period, the work of the Commission has been divided to 2 main branches, namely the completion of sales pending in 1923. So it was 1923 up to 1929. So it was a 6-year period. And you'll see the kind of quantities, and I say, I don't expect anyone to go through this in detail, but you'll see that they, a purchase price of it, and here we are, 14,372 occupiers for the purchase of 436,000 acres. In addition, invested 22,000 purchases estates comprising 698 acres. So you can see even in the first 6 years, the amount of land that was being dealt with. The other thing you need to be careful of is people sometimes talk about untenanted land. That's land that was taken from the landlords and redistributed. But there could have been tenanted land there as well, which was also taken and possibly given to the tenants, or the tenants given assistance to buy it. So you need to just be very careful when you're going through this, what you're looking at. Put that in there, and I'll leave a copy of this with Irene if anyone wants to, or Irene has it, so you're welcome to read. But you can see that even in the first 6 years, the amount of land that was there. For instance, the Irish Land Commission, anytime it made a decision, and some of you will be very familiar with this, some maybe not be. If a government decision is made, and I had to do this myself when I was the Health and Safety Authority, it had to be formally published in Irish Ifigul. Irish Ifigul was very important before electronic communications, because all government decisions, even decisions of government agencies, had to be recorded in that Irish. I spent a few days trawling through these for 1 year in 1947. The books are about that thick, and for 1947, I think there were 2 books amounting to well over 2,000 pages. And of those pages, 50% related to transactions of the Land Commission. So basically the Land Commission was such a major agency that it actually filled about half of all the Irish Ifigul journals. In other words, anytime they bought a piece of land, anytime they distributed a piece of land, there had to be an entry in Irish Ifigul. It's a very laborsome and tedious way to get the information, but it is available if you have a lot of time and patience to go through it in the National Library. They're not available online, so it's a visit in person. So, but it gives a sense of the. Now, some of the numbers, you'll see that Ireland has an area of 20.861 million statute acres. So that's the land mass of Ireland. That's and that equates to 88,000 square kilometers, or what it was when I was going to school. We were told Ireland has 32,000 square miles. That number 6, but that's equivalent to 6.9 million hectares. But it's also equivalent to 30 million Irish acres, because 1 Irish acre is 1.6 statute acres, and anyone in the farming community will, of course, be terribly familiar with that. But that's just the rough. And about 64%, or 4.44 million hectares, is suitable for agriculture. So that is just some numbers, and that's why you have to be. Now, this is a quote from the UK Parliamentary Hansard. Just like we have www.eritas.ie, where you can get all of the debates from Dáil Éireann going back to the foundation of the state. They're all available online, and they make for, if you have insomnia, go on it, and they'll certainly knock you out of no time. The British Hansard has a similar, the British Parliament has a similar thing. It's called the Hansard. And this is a quote from the UK. And this dates from before independence, so it's not a big matter that remains to be completed. On 31st of March 1917, the position with regard to land purchase was as follows. According to the figures which were laid before the committee of the convention, the land which was sold, of which had been agreed, or which had been agreed to be sold, amounted to 410,000 holdings of an acreage of 13.5 million acres. Unsold remains 5.75 acres, or roughly 30% of the agricultural land of Ireland. It takes a little bit of work to reconcile what is in Hansard with some of these numbers, but you have to take that it was the whole island that we're talking about in 1917. So you need to take the Northern Ireland, the statute acres, agricultural land. So just it's a tedious thing getting this. Now this is about the records. I asked Eamon O'Keefe to put down a parliamentary question about the release of the Land Commission records, and the reply was to ask the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine has plans to digitise the record of the Land Commission and make them available to the public and to scholars electronically in view of the 100th anniversary of the Land Commission in 2023 and the historical importance. My department currently has no plans to digitise all of the 8 million plus. They don't actually know how many are there, somewhere between 8 million and 11 million. So that's a bit worrying in itself. Digitization of records on such a vast scale is not feasible at this stage in regard to both form and condition. So basically, over the last, since the Land Commission dissolution bill was first read into the record of the Houses, Sheila De Valera, who was then the Minister for Arts, Heritage, Culture and the Gaeltacht, gave an undertaking on the floor of the House to the then opposition TD, whose name is Enda Kenny. Of course, we are absolutely going to make all the records available as part of the National Archives. That was 1989. So we've come a long way, 33 years, and those records are still locked down. And of course, that was one of the first questions put down by Enda Kenny, then in opposition. And of course, when they got into office, they found all sorts of excuses. They were too expensive, too fragile, working documents. Really, none of them stand up because birth, marriages and deaths are working documents. The 1916 war records and pensions records are working documents. Yet when there was a will, they were digitized. Now that's my rant for tonight. So, okay. Who were these people? Well, the group I talked about is 24 families left the parish of Clonbur, made their way. This is the journey, as best people remember it, to Allenstown in County Meath. Allenstown is a little place between, it's sort of situated between the towns of Navan and Kells and sort of Athboy and Trim. Sort of it's nestled sort of in between those four towns. Now, where they came from was this area here, around here. So in here is Clopbrack, the Spotted Stone, where most of the people came from. My family, and Thomas's family, and the majority. But they came from the area. So this is Lochmask Upper, here, this little piece that comes in here. This is the main Lochmask, and some came out from Carrick out near here. So in this parish, that's where they all came from. However, it was called Nua Gaeltacht Bala Alien, or Gaeltacht Colony number 5. I love the language of colony. It's like you're moving a colony of gannets or a colony of something, but these weren't gannets, these were real people. So they moved the colony, or they established a colony, and it was Gaeltacht Colony number 5. Now, in the 1960s, when Professor Martin O'Kine was engaging with the department, he had a dream or a vision to actually create connections between all of the migrant groups, because there were large groups migrated, such as Rathcarn, Gibbstown, Allenstown. But then as the time went on, the big ranches that were available in Meath, Wicklow, Westmeath, Kildare, Dublin, there weren't as many there. So you were looking at smaller estates. So therefore the number of families who moved, and sometimes there were families moved who weren't from the same neighborhood. So they would find that they had new neighbors from some part of the country, whereas in Allenstown, the people from Clopbrack, they put beside the people from Clopbrack. The people from Ballyveon, they put beside Ballyveon. So basically, the families knew each other well before they settled in Allenstown. But the first colony was Rathcarn, or Rathcarn as it's sometimes spelled, C-A-R-R-O-N or C-A-R-R-A-N, 1935. Ballygib, or Gibbstown, 1937, was colony number 2. And these are generally not known about. Number 3 was Kilbride or Kilbregia. It was 1939, and Clongill was number 4 was 1939. But Kilbregia or Kilbride was actually right next to Rathcarn. So the Gaeltacht we now know as Rathcarn is made up of 2 migrations, one in 1935 and one in 1939. So it's all integrated. Similarly, Ballygaber, Gippstown, it's made up of 2 pieces, the 1937 migration and the Clongill migration in 1939. So there are 2 Gaeltachts surviving, and Allenstown did not survive as a Gaeltacht much. This is Clonbur. This is from the National Collection, his name can't remember. Lawrence Collection. I should remember the Lawrence Collection because when I started doing a search on my wife's family, her great grandmother was a Lawrence, a sister of the famous Lawrence. So it's a small world how you find connections. This is Main Street, Clonbur, just a few years ago, 1917. I should have moved my car out, but you can see really that very little has changed. See the line of houses there, here. The gable here, they put a gable on this and did a bit of modeling on it, but largely in a space of 100 years, it remained very much the same. Now, this is very small, but why migrate entirely in Ireland? Well, I'm going to go through sort of in some push factors, the congestion, the rural slum. I use the term rural slum in the book based on the fact that the conditions they found themselves were very similar in terms of population density, house sizes, conditions to what were called as the severe slums in Dublin. Some people sort of thought, oh, my family didn't come from a slum. I didn't use it as a pejorative term, but I was trying to illustrate, and I wasn't the first one. It was used by James Hack-Chuk and Robert Rutledge Fair, so I can't claim to have originated the term rural slum. The housing, the economy of Clonbur Parish, the poverty, severe and harsh landlords. In Ashford Castle or in Cong, it's considered a much more serious transgression to take a fish from the river or the lake or a bird off the mountain than to go in and steal the family silver in Ashford Castle. Such was the attachment to hunting and fishing, because that was to entertain royalty. And in fact, Lord Ardilaun did have the King of England there on a number of occasions. The famine, we all know about Gorta Moor, but we tend not to remember Gorta Bug as well. It didn't kill a lot of people, but it certainly caused starvation. And in the schools collection, I find that in the area in Clonbur, in Drishahan, which Jerry mentioned, there is reference to 1921 as being Blean the Sup. Basically, the reason they called it Blean the Sup was that it was so wet they couldn't dry the turf. So they were using bits of straw, hay, bracken, whatever they could get to light the fires that winter. Proselytizing. I don't think the proselytizing came as far east to a great extent as Annaghdown, but certainly on Loch Corrib, just west of Clonbur, was what might be one of the epicenters of proselytizing. A guy called Alexander Dallas from Monston in England came and set up a church there. And within a very short time, a very high proportion of the population had switched from Catholic to Protestant, not out of a desire, but out of absolute dire poverty, starvation, and survival. There's a few very good stories. I'll tell what them now, but there was one called the Butler Man, and he was distantly related to me, I believe. I haven't been able to work out the exact connection, but anyway, he was very friendly with the local vicar, the Church of Ireland vicar, and he was very well trusted by him. And this is not made up. I've been able to track him through paper clippings in the Freeman's Journal in the early 1850s. But the vicar gave him something like £18 to go buy sheep. Now, in 1850, that was a lot of money. So anyway, Butler didn't buy the sheep. He made his way to Liverpool, and from Liverpool he made his way to Pennsylvania and rocked up in Pittsburgh and was able to set himself up quite nicely. And I've been able to trace them. So they're always sort of interesting stories. But interestingly as well, I found, I'll actually come on to it later on. Murder. North Galway was murder central in late 1870s, early 80s. Extensive immigration to USA, UK, Black and Tan, Civil War. Galway was probably, after places like Tipperary and Cork, one of the most harshly hit counties in terms of Black and Tan activity. They actually shoved 1,000 Black and Tan officers at one stage into Galway. So, I mean, Galway was, I suppose, run over with Black and Tans. So Galway had a hard time. Having said that, there were pull factors. Not everyone wants to go. Well, the close-knit community, you know, one of the things that when we're going, one woman said, crying on the morning of the 29th of March, 1940, who were we going to fight with now? I mean, no, this was, it was probably intended as a term of endearment, but it's just a very strange thing. The language, the customs, the fear of change. So they were all there. Now, Albert Parish, the civil parish, the baseline study. So Major Robert Rutledge Fair did a baseline study for the congested district board, published on the 7th of September 1892. And he showed there were 469 families comprising 2,241 people. Now, what I have in here is just a little extract from the Chief Inspector's report dated 1939, which is on the Annaghdown migration, the Clonbur migration. And he said, investigation number SR 1539 revealed the resale of this estate, which is one of the more congested in the Fear area. So basically, it had been identified the area around Clonbur as one of the most congested areas. Now, what they wanted to do, because the Borough Land Act and the Land Acts around the early 1900s created a scenario where tenants could begin to buy their own land. But the Guinnesses were obstinately, or Lord Argyll was obstinately resisting it. And at one stage, Robert Rutledge Fair says, I believe there is no land available for sale in the Clonbur area. Now, Argyll went so far as when the Land Commission or the Congested District Board were closing in on them, because they wanted to compulsorily acquire some land around Con, he lost the deeds to it. And it took years to unravel the whole challenge of the deeds. But it's ironic that the last of the Guinnesses left Ashford Castle in 1939, and the Annaghdown crew left in 1940. So we left the West the same time as the Guinnesses for this different reasons. So basically we're saying, in order to be so 18 tenants to apply, so basically at this stage there were 18 tenants. He was saying there's no shortage of applicants. There are plenty of people. We have our first list and we have a reserve list. And in fact, two of my grandfathers applied. Both were given an offer, and my Maguire grandfather, my mother's father, decided it was all too lonely for him. And of course, it was only 6 months later that my mother married my father when he went back to build a house. And Sonny was left on his own, and he says, what was it? His sister-in-law, Biddy, said to him one day, "What's your Sonny? Can't fall on there. Now to come to me." He said, "Oh, the ugna, sir." So he was afraid he'd be lonely. And he said, and she said, "Agus na rasad gura bridgie galamat John Vallick." Nira. And she said, "Well, Via Saga Graha Holidas Notch at Graha. You knew about everybody's business, but you didn't know about your own." And that's probably true about Sonny. He knew what everyone was doing, but he didn't know his daughter was going to leave him alone in a few months' time. So that's the story about Sonny. But you will also, They're fluent Irish speakers because this gets back to what Jerry said. There was an attempt. Richard Mulcahy was chairman of a report in 1925, which showed that the language was dying in the West. Now, he wasn't the first. There were, so they came forward with the idea that when De Valera swept into power in 1932, well, we'll kill two birds with one stone. We'll relieve my congestion, and we'll also set up a Gaelic colony. Now, that idea really went back to the late 1800s, but it was revitalized when De Valera came into power, and on foot of the Mulcahy report, it says Irish is dying. So here was the opportunity, I say, and you saw Rathcarn, Gippsland, Clongill, Kilbride, Allenstown. So 5 in fairly rapid succession in the 1940s, and that was the end of it. So, although these applicants have signified their willingness to migrate if given full assistance of their IN 939, all right, to get 2 cows, so they wanted 2 cows, as well as the horse, and as they're poor and their old cows are unsuitable. So they had to leave the old cows behind, and indeed they were. So we move on. Now, housing was dire. This is a bit of analysis. So if you look at the census 1901, in Clough-Brack, first class houses none, second class house 12, third class house 43, and fourth class house 4. So the second class houses had 3 rooms, and there were 41 of those. Second class 41, yeah. Third class 13. Oh, I'm not sure what I've done there. I'll have to look at that. But basically, the total number of houses was 58, and there were 300 people living in. So that's an average of 5 point something people per house, and that could be tiny little houses. For instance, Clough-Brack over an example of housing, there were 58 dwellings, about 300 people. So that's an average of 5.2 per small house. And when I talk about a house, you know yourselves, the house is probably as big as this room, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit bigger, but not a whole lot. And by 1911, there were 54 houses occupied by 262 people. Families lived cheap by jowl in an area scarcely for 100 meters wide and many cases less. Now, Mark Carrigan, who was our next door neighbour to Thomas, he lived to be into his 90s, and so he was one of the last. He was about 13, 14 when they left, and he described that basically their house was so small that they had to more or less back in because they had to go in order, because there was not a free square foot on the floor or in bed. So Mark Carrigan, because the houses were very small, each room had a number of beds, but scarcely enough room at the end of the bed to get to the doorway. So basically, in the morning, he said they had to come out in sequence or climb over each other, and that's his actual memory of it. Now, if we look at the housing classification in the townlands from which they left, these are the Ardondies. So the only place that had Class 1 houses was Clough-Brack Upper, and other than that, it was second and third being the biggest group. And the reason there weren't more 4th-class houses, and this is interesting, was that the classification of the housing was based on the construction of the walls, the construction of the roof, the number of rooms, the number of windows, and a combination of those. And what actually brought, these would have probably all have been further back here if it wasn't for the fact that they were stone construction. So they were all dry stone construction. Had they been adobe, they would probably all have been shifted a bit this way. So despite it being very poor, there are parts of the country which had actually significantly worse houses because they were built from adobe walls, clay with a bit probably timber in them, and if you left them for 2 or 3 or 5 years, they'd fall down. So basically, housing was pretty poor. Typical houses, so 2-3 rooms. There were around, based on some of my calculations, around 400 square feet was a good house. You know, that was a good house back then. In fact, The house that my great-grandfather was in is now a shed. And I went back to see it, and I remember asking my father, and where's the rest of it? There was no rest of it. That was it. And there was a family of 10 grandparents, family of 10 parents, a grandfather, and 3 other children. So I estimate there were about 15 people in that house. How they lived in that house, I honestly do not know. But that was the reality for many people. So it's typical of a cottage from the Clonbore area. It doesn't look too bad. It looks like the postcards there, but you can see that was probably a decent house. Three windows on it. Thatch. I don't know if Barbara recognised the house. I don't. Now, I love these photographs. I put them in. This man was 91 when he migrated. So that tells you something about the pull factor. In other words, the urge. When a man of 91 who had been anointed some weeks previously said, I'm going east. So that was Mark Kerrigan, the poor old dog, 8 feet. That was the house. You can see that, it was kept nicely, whitewashed, and the scallops keeping it intact. So Mark Kerrigan was born around 1848. He wasn't terribly sure what age he is. So they weren't terribly sure. Was he 90? Was he 91? Was he 92? Not terribly sure. But he was born by 1848 and died in March. So he could have been somewhere between 91 and 93. March 1941, almost exactly a year from the time he moved. And he made a decision that he would be buried in Bohermeen, the local parish cemetery. So that would be where the descendants would look rather than hankering back. Now, some people were brought back. One of my mother's father, he was brought back in December 1961, I think, and bad frost and a few cars went off the road and things like that. But this man's grandson, Mark Kerrigan Jr., born around 1926, died in 2017, was a 13-year-old when he migrated, and he remembered the way people were squashed. So this is the grandson of this fella. And the father died a young man, so his mother was widowed, and she was Catherine McNamara from Jarrow. This is an interesting one because you see, this is his sister, the Yank, she's home. See, she has the shiny shoes, she has a bit of fur trim, so she would have been home. I find it great to have these photographs. And what I would say to you is, if you're doing any projects, get people to share with you the shoe boxes, the old butter boxes, whatever they keep, their albums, whatever keep them in, and digitize some of them, because it's surprising how, over the period that I was working on this, 10 people who were really valuable to me or more have passed. Now were fine ages, but it was important to capture their living memory. This is Mark again. I don't know who this lad is, but you can see poor little donkey. He was with the creels, he was a hard-working little donkey. Now, these are the houses they went to. But to compare and contrast, I couldn't get a plan, so I'm afraid I had to go out survey myself. So basically, there were 3 rooms and a family room. There were 4 rooms, little scullery, and there was a little porchy piece up here. And this is one that was nicely kept. And I had to airbrush the satellite dishes. Took me a night to airbrush satellite dishes and cables out of the photograph. But otherwise, the house is authentic. And there were two different styles. One had the porch was slightly different, but the basic layout of the house was the same. The windows were all standard sizes, so every window was a standard size, and they were all the windows. These were mass concrete houses. They were cold, and I remember the child, there'd be filigree of frost on the window, and it's great. But look, we were no different. We didn't know it. I mean, the old parcels came from America, and so the mother would. I remember one parcel came, and it was as big as with the tea chest, a massive big thing. They had to send someone with a car to the local train station to pick it up because the telegram came to say the parcel has arrived. And out comes my mother had an aunt in Boston, Jamaica Plain in Boston, and she had gone to America as a young woman. She did well. Well, no, she didn't. She married a man from Cavan, and he died in the Spanish flu. They had bought a house, and by having a boarding house, she actually became relatively wealthy. Wealthy enough to have a silver fox, an Astrakhan, and a mink fur coat. And she was a big lady, so there was a lot of fur in the coat. Anyway, they came home in the parcel, and my mother took them out, and she says, "Who would that fit?" So her aunt was a fine big woman, so she said that would fit my aunt Biddy Christie. So no, Biddy didn't want these. So like so many houses, these big coats were spread out on the bottom of the bed, and as children, we had fur coats on the bottom of the bed, and we didn't know any difference. And because you can imagine a country woman wearing fancy fur coats from America. It wouldn't have happened in the 60s and 70s, in my neck of the woods anyway. This is a 2-story version. You can see it's more like maybe 1.5 story. And this is the ground floor and the first floor. So you can see it was once again 4 rooms, a scullery, and they were almost exactly the same size, but you had a choice. So there were 3 different styles of house. And I suspect if people settled in Annaghdown, or the people from Annaghdown who went, if you go and visit their houses, it'll be one of these, because they didn't change this design of house for decades. Origin families in Annaghdown, longevity, they were living forever. My father lived to be 96, his father was 80. I think Thomas's parents were sort of 90s. If we went along the road, 90 was quite common. Mark Kerrigan Senior lived to be 90 something. His grandson lived to be 90 something. Granddaughter lived to be 90 something. Biddy Christie lived to be 90 something. John Higgins next door was 91. So, I mean, Mary Lydon across the road from us was 96. So there was a real, and I don't know whether that was longevity that was in their makeup, or whether that they found themselves in slightly better conditions that went on forever. So basically, between longevity and the fact that migration was seriously impacted. So one of the things the migration did, it almost brought a hard stop to emigration. In Clonbur Parish, about 80% of children in any family migrated. In my grandfather's family, there were 7, only 2 remained, and that was fairly typical. So I went through a number of families, and every family had cousins in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Jarrow, north of England, Boston, Massachusetts, Butte, Montana. I mean, I could name every state in the US, and someone had someone there, because very few stayed at home. The other thing that happened was a number of families were sending their children home for safety from the ravages or the risk of World War II. So basically, if you take everything, there was pressure put on the houses. And by the 1940s, this is my father. I'd have to give him a bit of talking to about health and safety, given but he survived to be 96, so he was okay. But so by the 1950s and 60s, many of the houses were added with additional bedrooms, kitchens, and bathrooms. So basically, they had to grow. The other thing that they got was, and I did a survey of the outhouses, very, very few of the, and if you look at some of the old Griffiths valuation records and the council valuation books, you'll see that people had house, office, land. House was their house, office was really whatever little bit of a shed they had. And it could be anything from a pigsty to a horse stable, probably be the most important one. Reminds me, pigs get very cold in the winter. One of my cousins said to me, yanks is sourer than muck sing ever. Which is worse, a pig in the winter or a yank in the summer? Basically, they both needed an awful lot of minding, you know. So Barbara can guess who's told me that. So basically, they got a horse stable that would take 2 horses, a cow shed that would take 8 cows, and a pigsty with a covered area to keep the muck nice and warm. He had to be inside because he was a very important part of the food. And that's the same. They got a hen house, and this is roughly the layout. This was the low level bit where you opened to get the hens out, and these were removable panels. They had the roosting bars, and so it was about 3.5, so about 11 feet by 10 feet by 11 feet. And in fact, one of the few surviving ones was in Thomas of the Land. So actually, before it was destroyed, I managed to go and measure it. They were built from mass concrete again. So the other buildings provided package were a house that took 8 cows, a horse stable that took 2 horses, a pigsty with a covered area, and a standalone hen house about 10 meters, 10 yards from the other sheds. And the outhouses were separated by about 20 feet. And generally, I don't know if you hear what they used to say back in my way, when people had to go out at night to do something, they said they would go to Chathanashel. They went to the ass house. I don't know if you had that here, but the Chathanashel, or the early loos, were generally parked away down beside the hen house. So it was a bit of a cold trek in a winter night. Now, this is the kind of record you get in the Land Commission. So this is the application for migration, reps John Holleran Loughlin. So my father was John, so I jokingly, or not joking, but I put myself, Martin John Bannock Jan Loughlin. So this is, my father was John, this is Bannock Jan Loughlin. So basically, there's in the name, there's the inbuilt genealogy, but it's even present here because there could be few people with the same name. So it was the reps of John Holleran Loughlin, because there were 3 John Hollerans in Clopbrack, so they had to identify which one it was. But Clopbrack, Upper Clonbur, County Galway, Ardalawn estate, folio, so it gives the reference folio, the annuity, and so on. Town and Clopbrack Upper, Island Moor, which was Ilan Moor, Ilan Mask. He had a bit of land on Ilan Moor. And it says I hereby apply, so basically to the Land Commission for migration and new holding situated in the Midland or Eastern counties, and should I be satisfied with said holding, I am willing to surrender to the Land Commission in exchange the holding of which particulars are set out above and remove with my family and belongs to the new building. This is his signature. My older grandfather, I'm afraid, had an old X. He wasn't as literate, and that was fairly common. Someone put X his mark. One of my sisters used to say, even after he moved to Meath, he couldn't speak any English much, bit broken. And his sister Julia, the one who had the fur coats, came back from America in 1955. Sonny had never learned English, and Julia had lost her Irish, and they hadn't seen each other in about 50 years. And my sister was translating between brother and sister who hadn't seen each other for about 50 years. And another sister said, Sonny could never say anything in English, but he was able to count his money in English. So that was Sonny. But you can see that Matthew Hanlon and the inspector was Peter Garrity, 863. So what I have here is Malachy Halloran is married, age 63. He has a wife, 1 son, 2 daughters at home. Son, age 29, unmarried. Daughters, 22 and 13. 22 and 13, unmarried. Son in America. My son's in America. 2 sons in England, 2 girls at school and training college. In a training college means no cash in bank. All of his life farming on a mountain holding, mixed farming, mostly tillage. The son does some small jobs, contracting, building houses. self and family fluent Irish speakers. So that's what he says. Chief Inspector's instructions of September 1939. The Turberry rights have been explained. Amazing how the Turberry rights are now big issue 83 years on, you know. The Turberry rights have been explained to the prospective migrant, and he is anxious to take his chance of getting a holding with Turberry. Similar picture for my other grandfather, Sonny McGuire. He's a widower, aged 52 years of age. He has a son aged 20 and a daughter aged 21. He has no cash in the bank, no shop debts, no plough or harrow, 2 cows, old. 3 calves, 2 yearlings, 40 mountain sheep, 1 donkey, 2 pigs, 14 hens, for man and no ducks. He had farmed all his life, farming on a mountain holding, mostly tillage, all spade work. Self and family are fluent Irish speakers. In accordance with the Chief Inspector's instructions of September 39, the Turberry rights have been explained, and he is anxious to take his chance in getting a holding. But when he was offered, he turned it down, and there were plenty of families to step in at short notice to take the place. So I think that's indicative that they were not flush with a lot of money. You know, it was subsistence farming and survival, really. And interestingly, shows Stockrack lore taken from the Lawrence collection again. They call it America, County Mayo, but actually it's America. It was called Baile Verica, the townland of America. And we believe the reason it got the name was it was the townland at which crossroads they gathered for the American wakes for a period of 100 years. So it was known as Baile Verica. Barbara might have a view of that. That's what I've always heard, that it's Baile Verica. We used to gather at the crossroads for the wakes. But interesting, that's what it's like now. So you can see the mountain.
Yeah.
See here. Here. And you'll see the road. It's a very different landscape now to what it was then. You can offer your view, whether you think it's better or worse, but it goes to show you that every square foot of land had to be used, and they only had a couple of acres each, so they could not but farm it well.
Which year was it?
Photograph was taken, there's no one.
No, the other one.
The other was taken in the late 1800s, and it was taken from a place where there's now a quarry. It was known as Drimeen, the little hill, and it was where the photographer, it wasn't Lawrence himself, it was a jobbing photographer, was able to climb up to a height to get the photograph. It's a beautiful photograph, you know, even. So, murders. That mass murder, 3rd of January, 1992, 1892. I have finger trouble. And this was the living memory of older people. So 3 men from Clough-Rack were hanged for the murder of January 1883. So they were hanged in 1883. The murder was 1882. And the community was absolutely riven by the events, and there was a veil of silence over the events. Even when I started going back there, this was not a subject that people would talk about. This was only something that would get talked about when you built up a relationship with someone and they would share some things with you. But there's no doubt my 2 grandfathers were born in 1875 and I can't remember, one was 1875. So there would have been children. So this was an event in their living memory. And in fact, someone I was talking to Barbara about was a man called Tom Moore. He was Tom Mannion, and he was implicated in this. And in fact, he was made by the party who murdered the guy to actually shoulder the corpse of one of the Huddies. It was Joe Huddy and his grandson John. They were process servers there on behalf of Guinness, and they had to get the process served before the Gale Day, and it was in January, because if they didn't get the process served, the eviction would fall for a number of months. So Huddy was told not to go in, and there was an RIC barracks literally 100 meters from where the events took place. But he was a tough operator, and he said, hell or high water, I'm going in. So himself and his grandson went in, and there's books written about it, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But basically, there was a Carrigan man. It was there's lots of stories, some are possibly true, some are not, but who had a gun, allegedly, But anyway, when they came in, whatever happened, Joe Hoodie was, no, they had the gun. The grandson got a fright. He ran, he was shot, and then they actually stoned the old man Joe. And it's reported that he went down fighting and shouting, "Tell your yow, come on, you devils." And while they were stoning him, so he was stoned and killed. They took the two bodies, they wrapped them in burlap, weighed them with stones, brought them out into La Masque, and buried them deep, deep, deep. So after the young fella who had driven them there was waiting for hours, basically the RIC figured the worst. So they brought a little, what's called the pennant from the HMS something, which was moored in Galway Bay. They took it up Loch Corrib, so up by your way from Galway Bay, up Loch Corrib. They went all the way to Lislochry near Con. They took it out of the water and they brought it on rollers overland to the ferry bridge, and they launched it on La Masque. So, and they trawled it for about 27 or 8 days, and there was also some stories about it. Anyway, they arrested a whole lot of men, and the first time I started to do family history, I knew my father was John, and I knew my grandfather was Malachy, but I didn't know an awful lot more than that. So I asked my father who his grandfather was, so he was John or Sean. So I searched for it. And what's the first thing that comes up? A prison record. And the charge was concerned with murder. And first, oh, that must be someone else's. It's hardly mine. But no matter how much I tried to think otherwise, of course he was mine, because you remember that on the land commissioning it says Island Moor or Ilan Moor. So therefore he had a piece of land on the island, so he had a boat. The reason he was interrogated was that they literally started at the crossroads in Clough-Rack, and every man for about a mile was brought in for interrogation. And he was interrogated for a number of weeks and released and never charged. So that's it. But 3 men who, 2 Higgins and a Flynn, John Flynn, were hanged and found guilty. And the murder trial was held in Green Street Courthouse. And it was the same prosecutor, Bolton, as prosecuted the Monttrasna murders, which took place 7 months later. Bolton was later discredited for having engaged in fraudulent activities. He was brought up from Tipperary because he had a reputation of being a tough operator. But he was discredited somewhat later by O'Malley, who was an MP for Mayo. He challenged him, and Bolton was basically, he was dismissed from the service sometime later. But it was a bit of a, Margaret Kelleher has written a book about the travesty of the Monttrasna murders, and really it was around poor translation. There were, some of them had limited English, but most of them were very limited. And there was one lady, my great-grandmother's brother was Michael Holleran, and his wife was Julia Higgins. So in fact, it was Julia's brother and nephew. No, Julia's brother, uncle, and brother-in-law were the 3 men who were hanged. And she was brought to Green Street Courthouse barefoot, very little English, and interrogated. And so there I found it in the court transcript. So anyway, that's just that one. The Monttrasna murders in August 1882 was also talked about in hushed tones. So George Bolton later discredited with it. Lord Mountmorris was a magistrate, and he was murdered on 25 September 1880. Thomas Gibbons, son of Roger Gibbons of Dringhy, was attacked while returning with his mother from a pattern day in Clonbur. He died on 19th of March, just 11 weeks after the Holy Murders. And a bailiff named Flynn was attacked in February 1883 and left for dead within a short distance of the Holy Murders. And despite much talk of his demise, Flynn made a good recovery. So, but it was an attempted murder. So it was also the time of the murder of Cavendish and Burke in Phoenix Park in 1882. So really murder was, sorry, I've only given a few of them. I could have found another 5 or 6 murders or attempted murders or very violent agrarian crimes. So it wasn't a happy place, and these were all within the living memory. Now, the other thing we found is that court cases, Lord Ardilaun was rather famous. He was the one who entertained royalty in Ashford Castle. He married the daughter of the Earl of Bantry, because we live in a very modern society now where men can have relations with men and women with women and whatever mixture you want. It's the contemporary way of living. In Ardilaun's time, same sex and same gender relationships were absolutely verboten. So Ardilaun had this proclivity, so he was known to frequent many of the clubs in London. But for respectability, the match was made with the daughter of the Earl of Bantry. No issue emerged from that marriage, and it's alleged that the local priest in Clonbur was the only one who occasionally had to travel to Dublin to comfort the poor daughter of the Earl of Bantry. She used to stay in Wynn's Hotel, and the priest would travel to comfort her. Anyway, that's the. And by the way, I'm not making that up. Joe Joyce has written about it. So there's a big book about the Guinness. So by the way, he was having rows all the time, and I mean, he objected to the railroad from Hope to Dublin because it crossed his property in Raheny, Siddar's Park, and he objected to that. And so, I mean, if you go through the letters, he's rich material for researching, but he took cases against, I'm going to say, the thing about the Fisher fowl from the estate. And my great grandfather, a man called Pat Murphy, was retained by Guinness family to patrol Shannadullon Mountain. So one of the chief witnesses some case around Clonbur was from the town of Tonsley through the Bee on the side of Shannadullon Mountain, and he was my great-great-grandfather, and he was employed as a caretaker by Arthur Edward Guinness to patrol Coola, Shannadullon, Mount Gable or Binileva, and other scenic mountains on the Guinness estate. So he watched out for trespasses and unlawful activities such as cutting bogwood, pulling heath, and taking fowl from the mountain or fish from the rivers or lakes. The tenant farmers and the others were brought to court for pulling heath, and they were typically fined 2 shillings, 3 shillings, and a shilling or 2 costs. I mean, that kind of money they had easily, but for minor transgressions like pulling a bit of bracken or heather, that's what Guinness did. Very, very litigious. So it was considered a great offence to take fish or fowl from the mountain. Now, poor old Pat let down his guard. And Pat and the daughter, Ardilaun versus Patrick Murphy, for like on the 10th of February on Shannadullon Mountain, defendant to the court admitted that he had no right to pull the heath there. So he needed to light the fire, and he pulled a bit of heather off the mountain, and he was done. So I expect he was no longer an employee of Guinness. I'd never figured out what happened to poor old Pat, my great-great-grandfather, on these mountains. You know, there were a good many fines before on his evidence. For like in his time of watching, he was fined 5 shillings with 3p compensation at costs of 2 shillings and 6p. The case against his daughter, Margaret Murphy, was dismissed. So his daughter, Margaret Murphy, who was sister to my great-grandmother, you would have heard of Kit, Christopher's mother. No, Christopher's wife, Michael Christie's mother. So this was her sister. So I think Pat and Guinness probably party company. After he acquired the estate in 1852, Benjamin Guinness set about evicting hundreds of tenants, farms implicating thousands of acres of land surrounding Ashford Castle, and planting of wildfowl as cover for wildfowl for his guests to enjoy on their fishing and hunting expeditions to Cong. So this explains how there was more than 10,000 acres of untenanted land. Now, there's a book written called Land, Lust and Good Fire by Francis Bacon. And in it, he describes the probably the single best shooting place in Ireland was Ashford Castle and the grounds of Ashford Castle around Con. And they would bag so many woodcock, snipe, and everything. And Bacon goes into some level of detail. This is the man Bacon who was an economic advisor to the government, but he wrote a very interesting book, as I call Land Lust and Gunsmoke. So he talks about the carryings on in the big houses, but how they revolved around. Now, it was Guinness, but before was the third Earl of Leitrim, William Sidney Clements. The title of that is William Sidney Clements. The third Earl of Leitrim and Charlemont. He's descended from the Browns of Westport. He was descended from the same lineage as the Browns of Westport Castle. But he was accused of exercising droit de seigneur, the feudal right of the first knight, jus prima noctis. Basically, to boil it down, he felt he was entitled to go to bed with young women on their wedding night. And this allegation persisted everywhere from Donegal all the way down through Leitrim, Roscommon, Mayo, Sligo, into Mayo or Galway. So it wasn't an isolated instance. So a man called A.P.J. Malcolmson has written a book about him, and in it, Malcolmson acknowledges the rumors and allegations against Third Earl as a coercive sexual predator who would seek to take any female of his tenantry whom he desired for pleasure. Females might be taken in lieu of rent or in pain of eviction to families. However, some of you are old enough to remember Marina Bobbitt in, I think it was Virginia in the 1980s. She was having a bit of a bad time with the husband. And she took a knife to his article and she threw it out the window. Anyway, when that happened, the chatter started around Clough-Brack and Clonbur. Oh, that's not the first time that ever happened. So, a young Joyce girl was getting married, and the brother was very concerned that the Lord might seek his wicked way with her inappropriately. And so she had a gallant brother, and he dressed up as a bride. And he went to pay his visit to the summer house in Clonbur Woods, or Soapborg, Canny Country. Soapborg is a good source. Anyway, well, things got off too good. I mean, the Lord was pleased to see the putative bride, and shall we say, the Rulia started, and things got a bit steamy. And as things were getting better, the brother pulled out a knife to sever the instrument of the third Earl, known as Leitrim Baccaw. Of course, we don't know whether this is true, but it's a good story. But having said that, Malcolmson admits that this was an allegation that was made all the way from Donegal, such so that the third Earl of Leitrim was assassinated at Point Black Range in Donegal in 1878. And it's alleged that the man who killed him was at close range and he had red hair. And the next day, every man with red hair in Donegal was told to shave their heads. And it never went, they never identified. But the man who did it couldn't go to his eternal reward. So he lived into I believe, the 1940s, and he confessed it to a priest, and the word got out. But he was never got for it, but he saved his eternal redemption by confessing it to a priest. So it's alleged. It's a good story here. So the eviction scenes on the third Earl of Leitrim have become synonymous with some of the worst excessive landlords. Now, separately, what I did was I Googled third Earl of Leitrim or Earl of Leitrim Baccaw or whatever, and hundreds of stories came through the school's collection. So he was absolutely notorious. He was lame because he had a fall from a horse in a riding accident, so he was known as third. But James Gilheany, who was aged 80, told the story to someone. He wanted to tell the story, but he told it and it was recorded in 1937. In those days, landlords exerted extraordinary powers over the tenants. Even the most tyrannical king wielded no such power as Lord Leitrim, for he was judge, jury, and executioner throughout his whole estate. So basically, that was someone. Besides being landlord, he was also a magistrate and he used the power of such to dishonour the wife and daughters of his tenants. If a tenant refused to send his daughter to act as a servant in Lord Leitrim's castle, the tenant was evicted and perhaps punished or fined in the law court for crimes he'd ever committed. So he was a nasty bit of business and he left a legacy. Now, Innises were so paranoid after things after the First World War that someone might take a pop at them. So when they acquired the estate in 1852 and the encumbered estates auction in 1862, their favourite place for their parties and their picnics was Lough Coolan, beautiful little lake up high on Mount Gable or Binleva. And he would have to cross the road at a number of points in going from Ashford Castle to Coolan. So what they did was they built these underpasses under the road in 1918, and you can still go and you'll see the stone and you can see the 1918 on it. This is a pedestrian underpass going into Ashford Castle near Con. So basically, he had it such that there was only one point between Ashford Castle and Coolan Lake where they had to come out, and that was near the Pigeonhole. Some of you may know the Pigeonhole, it's east of Con. And there was one point there where, because of the structure of the ground, it wasn't possible, it seems, to build an underpass there. So you had to be careful crossing there. So they were quite paranoid about their safety. There you go, right? Now, what were the circumstances like? This gets back to Robert Rutledge Fair again. So a family in poor circumstances, their income between, so for instance, a pig, a bullock, sheep, 1000 weight of oats, 80 stone of potatoes, 1,390 eggs, not all hens, flannel and stockings, £24, and their expenditure. So they were slowly going under. You know, doesn't seem like a lot. £24 and 6 shillings. So it's, you know, £1, sorry, it's £2, sorry, £1, 7 shillings and 6pence. But that was hard to find if they had things. A family, what they called ordinary circumstances, had an expenditure. They were a little bit better off. £43. This is estimated by Rutledge Fair, about £43, and their outgoings was about 41. So they had a little bit of a nest egg, £1 maybe or two a year. Now, family in poor, what did they eat? Well, a family would eat about 5 tons of potatoes a year. A lot of potatoes, was the staple diet. 300 weight of oats at 6 shillings, and 300 weight of straw at 30 shillings per ton. Now, so this poverty and congestion was documented as early as 1892 by the Congestionist Board. Major Rutledge Fair prepared a baseline report in 1892 in which he set out the level of congestion described as Joyce Country, Clunburg, Con, Kerr, Letterbrick and Ross, and he described in detail the resources available, the type of agriculture. So that's very, very well documented. So there's no doubt poverty was rife. Further reports on the food in Ross and Exeter Division and sometimes on Con and Clunburg during the months of November, December, January, the people are said to take only 2 meals daily, one at 9 a.m. and the other at 6 p.m. Tea and homemade flour bread is used as the morning meal. In the evening, potatoes with fish or milk or tea if the milk is not plentiful. During the remainder of the year and in other parts of the district, 3 meals are taken daily. Breakfast at 8 a.m., dinner at 1 p.m. and supper at 9 p.m. Tea is always used for 1 meal at least. And if the people can afford it, they take tea twice and in some cases 3 times daily. Potatoes are generally partaken of once daily and very poor people twice. Potatoes are used as also Indian meal. Stir-fried takes their place. It's said that oatmeal is also used because people are gradually ceasing to take Indian meals. So basically, it's just an example. I mean, the one woman drawing dung is from the Rutledge Fair collection, and that's from National Library of Ireland. So give me permission to use that, but you can see that it was hardship. Bertha Moore I'm not going to go into this detail, but basically Connacht accounted for a very high, disproportionately high percentage of fatalities. So basically Connacht accounted for 40% of excess deaths, Munster 30, Ulster 20, and Leinster 8.6. So you can see that Connacht really took a bad whack in terms of the fatalities in the Great Famine. The Gorta Bug and Bleed Us Up. I put in souping salin because my mother used to have an expression if we were complaining that she'd say, she'd talk about souping salin. Basically, it was a mixture of probably crystallized salt with milk. And I think the idea was that the salt became usable if you dipped it. But if someone complained, she'd say, you have to fata agus souping salin, you get potato and a pinch of salt and milk, and that'll be your dinner. So now, proselytizing, this is a great story. The young American Connacht Weekly had published a report on the Convent session. The court was packed for the main case, which included the Catholic and Protestant clergy from the parishes of Ross and Con. The only case of importance that had Mark and Michael Holleran jumpers against some 20 persons. So for an assault, principally women, which was adjourned twice for the last 2 months. Both parties to the case were legally represented in court. The Holleran brothers and many witnesses were cross-examined by lawyers for the plaintiffs and defence. The hearing was lengthy with conflicting evidence, and the Hollerans didn't corroborate each other's version of the case. However, it makes for great reading in the Freeman's Journal. The evidence adduced in court described how the Hollerans came to Con by boat from further west along the shore of Loch Corrib. They came in from Carrugaru, which is west, but on arriving there was jeering and heckling. In the melee that ensued, Mark Holleran was pushed into the lake in Con. In order to save himself, he grabbed the leg of a stout woman on the bank. So he was thinking fast. Whereupon she also entered the water. The locals pulled the woman to safety, and Mark Holleran was also saved, as he held steadfast to the woman's leg until he reached the bank and was rescued. At this time, the police arrived. He was brought wet and bedraggled to the local RSC, where he remained until night time. Now, exactly what kind of cousin they were, I don't know. But I managed to trace these both had converted, and they were out near the Hill of Doon, where Alexander Dallas had set up his proselytizing church. And they were really miserably poor. But I know that they had converted because I found their marriage records from 1850 or thereabouts. And civil records for Catholics only started in 1864. So therefore, if there were marriage records for these boys in 1850, 51, they had to be Protestant. But anyway, the Bishop of Tuam fought back, and they were harried from pillar to post. And Michael married twice. And he had about 7 or 8 children, and he ended up at one stage out west near Rossmuck, and he was in Moycullen. So I tracked him around the place, but he ended up in America. And what enabled me to identify definitively that I was saying was he had twins. And I found them on the ferry, on the boat going to America, and the twins. The ages were shifted a bit, but the sequence of children and the twins were exactly the same. So they settled in New York, and Michael's son became what might be now the equivalent of a lorry driver. He was literally, he got an old van at the turn of the century, turn of the 1900s, and he was trucking stuff around New York and became quite wealthy. And then his son married well. But through DNA testing, I have managed to make contact with something like a 4-great-time grandson of Michael, who is Tom. His name is Tom Mungeer, and he's a cop in New York. And we exchanged correspondence, and we were able to figure through DNA that our common ancestor was born sometime around 1770s. And we think we know who he is, but not sure. Then Mark was missing, and he ended up in Massachusetts. And I was DNA matching with these 2 women in Massachusetts. And after about 6 months, we figured out they were descendants from Mark Halloran, because these guys were literally run out of the country by the Bishop of Tuam. I'm not offering values. I'm not saying this right or wrong. I'm just saying these are the historical facts. But these would have been cousins to my great-grandparents and grandparents. They would have known this. I have no doubt they would have known it. They didn't talk about it. But it's a little bit like Professor Garrett O'Toohey, who's from Galway. Once he wrote a review of Super Than Jumpers, the book, and he says that, you know, it's a little bit like when you get proselytizing, you have people moving, but he says it's a little bit like when birds migrate in a harsh winter. As the weather improves, they'll begin to migrate back. And that's exactly, he was prophetic, because as time went on, people began to convert back. And by the 1930s, 40s, there were only a handful of people, Protestants left in the parish of Clonbur, who had converted or descendants in the 1850s. This is really just about Black and Tans. And I mean, as I said, County Galway was hit with a barrage of 1,000 Black and Tans being sent there. So after, I suppose, Cork and Tipperary was up there and one of the counties, and there's hardly a parish that doesn't have horrendous Black and Tan stories. And the people I got the Black and Tan stories for were the women, because they were the ones who were minding the children. But my grandmother, she had 8 children by 1920 and rearing 3 other children. And the townlands of Clonbur Upper, Drishahan, Buchan and Beltray, they were actually could look towards Clonbur and hear, because there were rickety old roads, you'd hear the rumble of the Black and Tan trucks moving. And what they would do is she'd gather up the children, run up the mountain, hide behind the gorse and the rocks. Now, that's her example, but look, there are dozens of examples. I'm giving that as an example, but it's only one. And then my Laffey cousins, one morning Black and Tan called to the Laffey house, and Michael Laffey, who was my father's first cousin, was indeed in a flying column in the old IRA. And he subsequently became one of what's known as Bros Boys, the guy who became one of the first guy in the 1920s when the Garda was established. Bro was the guy in charge of what subsequently became the special branch. But they arrived into the house. They obviously had some tip off. They knew he had some connection. The mother was a tiny little woman, and the bed was warm, but he was up the hill, and they threatened her, and she didn't flinch. So literally, they just swept all her most valuable possessions, her bit of crockery, onto the floor, and that. So there were, but every parish in Galway, like I'd say, I'm sure you have them. These, so basically, some of the women had brothers who were killed. So this is very, very recent. So it wasn't a very happy place. Now, migration. This is where we're at. This is by the Vertical. This is where the American wakes were held. So the neighbours assembled after daily work was done for music, dancing, storytelling, reciting of poetry, spoken the little clay pipe or dudgeon, keening, lamenting, crying and merrymaking, putching, port, tobacco and stuff were passed around, and the festivities continued till dawn. And then the people will travel the 19 lonely kilometres by foot or horse to Ballinrobe, and from Ballinrobe they would get the train to Cork and on to Cove, Queenstown to Liverpool. There was also the James Hack Chuck, who was the Quaker philanthropist. He had an assisted emigration program in 1883. It's about 2,500 people, I think, from memory, availed of that. A lot of people went to Portland, Maine. This is the pull side, the pull side. This is from Thomas's mother. I didn't know Thomas was going to be here, but she, well, she was no lady. She described her early life. She said, I spent my early years in a village in Galway called Clonbur. It was an Irish-speaking village, and the old people knew no English. There was a river running by our house, and I ran to Clonbur, which was to the back of our house. We were surrounded by hills, large families were in every house, and the neighbours were friendly. You could walk in any house day or night, no locks on the doors. The old people were great storytellers, and many nights spent listening to the tales. They were especially good with old ones. For ringworm, take the top off hushies and put into a saucepan with unsalted butter and cook it. That's it. So basically, she gave a lovely account of her memory, and it was published in a local magazine in Kells, come off, I think. But they had, I mentioned the one after they were going, who we have to fight with. There was also the local priest described the loneliness they were going, strong men kissing stone walls and tears. Not sure that's the men who stayed or the men who left, but basically probably both. But they had all sorts of, this is one that was banned by the church. They used to sing, from stuff ramsto Annaghdown so Annaghdown down is for an I imagine. From stuff ramsto, a woman who could dance, who would make merry, would drink beer and could get up in the morning. That's some woman who could party all night and get up and work in the morning. This was banned by the Vatican in the mid-1800s because it's believed that its origin in some French. So what from France, so the different views, but that was it. So they had all sorts of it's over a the war one, it's over a crown, Scotland, Green, like what's the oh, my loving mother and my love, sunshine only once a year at Tom Joyce's house. Tom Joyce was in the valley and it's Tom Watson. So moving on, moving on our astonishing moving the Gruesing Tom Martin. There are many writers in the back of Tom Joyce's house. So they had all their little stories and we heard them growing up. Now, where did they go to? The new homeland. This was the Waller estate. So basically, the Land Commission were quite clever. This, you see, striped here. So what you're seeing here is the old estate with the field boundaries and then the striping of the new farms on that, because the idea was that every farm had to have road and water. So basically the farms were striped road to river, or if there was a well or a pond or some little pool, then that would suffice for water. But every farm had to have, and the way they did it was to maintain peace between local congests. The pink is what they gave to local people, and the non-pink is what they gave to the migrants. So these are the townland. So that's a great water estate with Land Commission farm striping. Farms are road to river or their waters. This is the same place with, you see now that the striping has become hedges, because part of the deal was, and this was fairly standard Land Commission practice, that you got an allowance, but you had to build hedges and ditches for it. So they had to plant hawthorn hedges. So by the 1960s, 70s, 80s, these were mature hedges. So literally the numbers are the farms. So you can see the striping has now matured into, so the fields were sort of long and narrow. So all the 24, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 30, all around, one underneath there. So they're the 24 farms. They actually were quite progressive in terms of their agriculture. Milking machines. This is a receipt that Thomas kindly gave me. Basically, but you can see that after rural electrification, what happened was they had mixed farming, and then because they were within 30 miles of Dublin, and this was actually fairly common for migrations into Meath, that within a relatively short period, they took up dairy farming, because dairy farming at that stage was the closest thing to a day job. You know, the check came once a month in the milk can, might be butter in it and other things, but the check came once a month. It might be a big check, but it was a regular check. And so as soon as rural electrification came in the 1950s, they started getting milking machines, and Alfa Laval would come in and they put in milking machines in a whole line. So basically, they started agriculture, started dairying in the mid-1940s, just after the end of the war. They started dairying, and my father and one or two others were some of the first to try this dairying lark, and they supplied milk to the Dublin, liquid milk to the Dublin market. So milk machines, haymaking was a job for everyone. This is thrashing. This is the metal in action. So it was all hands on deck for the thrashing. Grass silage demonstrations. Silage making happened in Annaghdown at the very earliest silage making that happened in Meath, because there was an agricultural instructor, a man called Tom Corley, and he was quite progressive, and he got a willing and responsive audience in the farmers in Annaghdown. So he'd come out and he'd spend a bit of time with every farmer. He'd give them counselling on agricultural practice like fertilizer, modernizing practice, and they moved to. So it's interesting that this is my father, John O'Halloran, Rotherton Cortown. This was 1957, so that was the first silage that was made in County Meath, or some of the first. Turns out that J. O'Halloran, Horace and Kenny is my uncle. Or born Ashfield, I don't know. And it was just T. Corley and then born Tom Corley. So basically they were quite progressive in terms of farming practices because they had big families, tiny little farms. So was Annaghdown successful as a Gaeltacht? Simple answer is no, because every other Gaeltacht was given a Gael school. Annaghdown wasn't. Despite the fact that there was a little school, Church of Ireland school there, which had about 15, 20 pupils in it, would have been ideal. But they actually closed that down, and the woman who was teaching in it, Mrs. Piggott, had to go somewhere else to get herself a job, and they could have actually converted easily. Now, they didn't give any support, and when Rathcarn and Gippstown were officially designated as Gaeltacht areas in 1967 or thereabouts, they excluded Allenstown. Now, I was a child in school, and the inspector came, the Kicker came to school and spoke to a number of children. I remember he came to the house and interviewed myself and my sister, and probably other houses. I only remember my own experience. That's great to get to see, Adri. He determined that the critical mass of houses out of the 24 where Irish was the principal language was too small to warrant designation as a Gaeltacht, so it didn't get the designation. What was the impact on the cycle of immigration? It almost cut immigration immediately. That's not to say that there wasn't immigration, there was. But people emigrated either to be with family or to see the world, but it wasn't the absolute severest economic necessity. So I did an analysis and found that a lot of children stayed. Was it an economic success for the migrants? I believe it was, but it's not what I believe. It's what the migrants' families believed when I interviewed them, because it was a success because it gave them access to the greater Dublin market for jobs, for employment. So basically, there was an opportunity to get off-farm jobs for the children. So they could get them in Dublin. They didn't have to go to London. They didn't have to go to Pennsylvania. They didn't have to go to Scotland. They had them there. What was the impact on those who remained? Well, actually, it's a little bit like the rising tide lifts all boats. Because what happened was, when they vacated the vacated land was redistributed among the remaining farmers. So it helped a bit. However, because of proximity, if you were in Clonbur, it's probably going to take you almost as long to get to Dublin if you were working as you would to London or New York. It just became the dynamic wasn't as strong there. New housing, what was the impact? Well, the houses were twice as big. I think it probably helped their health, their longevity. Well, I mentioned the adoption of agricultural practices. The landscape is unrecognizable from what it was because the old fields, and I'm not offering a view whether that's good or bad, I'm just saying it's different. Marriage patterns before and after migration, well, basically, if you were to look at the people in Annaghdown, everyone was some kind of a relation of someone else. So there were cousins and first and second and third, and it was basically sometimes you had to look hard to find it, but everyone was related to everyone. But after the migration, shall we say, the gene pool was widened. And within a few years, there's a great story that the first big skirmish that happened was in August 1940, when the football field was promised to the locals and the football field was promised to the migrants. And sure, of course, promised two groups of young men something, and they'll manage to fight over it. So they did. And the migrants thought it was their land, and the locals thought it was theirs for football. And Craig Waller had indeed promised. But the Land Commission, this was an area where there were less than up front. So there was a showdown of young men from the west. One was my uncle, one was next door neighbour, one was Burke, and one was my father's first cousin. So they were right in there in the melee. And the locals had sticks, pitchforks, and a gun. So there was a gun produced, and that was, I think, this 1940. So we're only talking 20 years after independence. So it's still very early days. But anyway, the Gaeltacht lads were all arrested, and none of the locals were arrested. So the case ran for about 2 years. And basically, the investigating Garda presumed to translate the names from Gaeilge to Béarla. He took upon himself to decide what their names were rather than the names they gave. So the judge was very scathing of this overstepping the mark. Eventually, it ran for, say, about 2 years, and it was thrown out of court. And he wrote a superb judgment. It's in, I've lumped it in the book, but I checked him out. I found he had an MA in English literature, so it was evident in the style of which he wrote his judgment. So the gene pool got diverted. Why did they make the migration? Well, I think we know poverty, not a nice place to live, a lot of troubles, nasty landlords. Interestingly, the landlords in County Meath, the Wallers, were actually very benign. And rather than having photographs of them with royalty, there are photographs of them on the steps of the big house with the workers. And interestingly, the last Waller was a man called Vice Admiral Arthur William Craig Waller. Sounds like very tough, you know, but interestingly, he was a man of some, I would argue, personal ability rather than just having acquired property and title. He started off, he was born in Birr, I think it was Birr, he was Offaly anyway, and he became an officer in the British Navy, and he had a fairly turbulent early time, but eventually he rose to the rank of Vice Admiral, which was the second in command of the British Navy, and he captained the HMS Bounty at the Battle of Jutland in the First World War. So he was a man who had garnered some respect by virtue of his own abilities. So therefore he had what I call ability to deal with people, because he had dealt with soldiers during World War I, and he was a much more genial individual. So he was different. What was the cultural impact? Well, basically the language went mostly. But it's interesting that nowadays the music and the storytelling is very strong. On the 4th of May 1990, it was celebrated to mark the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the migrants in Galway, and this was called Craig of Bailey Falls. So these are the descendants, one for every family, who gathered together, and there was a big party, and I think we partied into the small hours. And the neighbours, and the only little bit of a dark shadow on it was that someone who was still disgruntled 50 years on the local pub scrawled, "Migrants go home." Like this was 50 years on. Now, whether it was a prank or whether it was someone with some deep-seated resentment, I don't know. And sometimes you're as well as not worry too much about it. So that was 1990. Roll on another bit, 2015, 75 years on. And there was a great old party in Clonburr this time. This is Maggie Munro. She was 19 when she left. So she was 75 and 19. So that would make her, yeah, 17, maybe 19. Anyway, about that. And this is Kieran Burke. Sadly, Kieran has passed and Maggie has passed. And this is Kieran and Maggie leading out the first waltz at the celebrations in Burke's in Clonburr. And interestingly, This person here is my brother, who is also passed, and it's the chap to whom I dedicated the book. But this is sort of the kind of tribute. This is my sister planting a tree. She was supposedly the first child born after the migration, but I don't think that's quite true. She was the first born of a marriage after them, but there were children. Shall we say there were children conceived in the West, born in the East. So, so then in 2017, someone decided to have a football match where the descendants of the migrants would come back and show the originals how to play football. But it didn't work quite like that because the locals gave them a good old trouncing. But it turns out that the captain of the migrant team was my nephew, Dara O'Halloran. And this young man who was the captain of the St. Patrick's in Clonbur is Owen Joyce. And I was thinking, I asked someone quickly, who's Owen Joyce? Turns out Owen Joyce and this guy were fourth cousins. This was the first time they ever met. So it was interesting. They didn't know. They would have not known. Because I was interested in genealogy, I asked, who's Owen Joyce's father? He's the son of Stephen. So Stuff on show you. And his mother was Nappy Patsabini. Grandmother was Nappy Patsabini. Nappy Patsabini was first cousin to my mother, and her husband was first cousin to my father. So not only were they, we related to him on both sides, through my father and through my mother, which wasn't terribly uncommon, but it was the first time. So there was representing the Malachy O'Halloran Cup to Owen Joyce, who was his first cousin, and this is the first time they met. Now, I put in something here, and pardon me if I'm teaching something, but as I said, I was an accidental author. I had written technical pamphlets and things during my working career, but I hadn't done anything like this. And I was saying earlier on that because I came from a scientific background, everything was written in the third person. It happened, it was noted, it was recorded, agent A met agent B. And I found it very difficult to learn to write in the first and second person. I and you were not in the training I had. So it took me a bit of time. So we started with the concept, the research. I love the research. I love digging into old files and old papers and everything. Then comes the writing, which is the tortuous bit. But copywriting, copy editing and proofreading, very important. I was on holiday a few years ago in West Cork, and I was saying to someone, I found this lovely, lovely book, and I looked forward to reading it so much. And it was on the stone circles of West Cork. And sure, look, I started into it and I just couldn't finish it because the copy editing was so poor. I thought to myself, if there are other aspects of this that aren't up to scratch, why am I wasting my time? It's a little bit like life is too short to waste something that someone else was never did. It's a little bit like life is too short to spend time reading a biography of Trump or something like that, but that's a very personal view. So very important to have copy editing and proofreading. Also, if you want it to be credible, I think you do need to keep your sources, your references, your citations, your permissions, in other words, so that if someone says, did he make up this? No, I didn't make it up. I put it in because someone either told me or I found a source for it. So it's very important to put in, where did you get your information from? If that's an interview with someone, put down interview with someone, when you interview them, and I have my personal notes. If it was a conversation, it was a telephone call. If it was, you know, a good documented source. You need to have these in. Then you come to the design and layout. You need to get your ISBN, your copyright, your price point, your barcoding, because when you come to design, these will all have to be built into the cover. So every book now has to have its barcode, so you need it. Indexing. You can't really do the indexing until you have the layout done, because you don't know what the page structure will be. So then you do your indexing. Printing. Marketing and launch, independent reviews, promotions, interviews. That's causing up to journalists, causing up to someone who'll write a review for you. If you can even get a review done before you publish it, that's even better, because you can put it on the cover. Distribution and control, including copyright libraries. So when you publish a book and you have your ISBN, you're legally obliged to give it to somebody, but I think it's about 13 copies you give away. So you have to factor that in, but you have to send them. Stock control, invoicing and reconciliation. This is my journey as a self-publisher, and I've tried to capture the steps. And of course, it was a total learning journey, because I thought, I'll write this up, I'll walk up to some publisher and I'll say, here you are, and they'll be so happily, they'll be delighted, they'll give me hugs and kisses. It doesn't work like that. They might reply to you in 3 months or 6 months and tell you it'll take us a year to do it. And I said, oh, geez, I don't have the time for that. So I decided on the route of self-publishing. And then you need your stock control, invoicing, invoice everything so you have a record. And if the day ever comes, a reprint. So that was my journey, and I won't be reprinting, I hope. Now, when it comes to research, I said to people, we have a word in Irish which you're all totally familiar with, seanchas. There is no single word, sentence, or phrase in the English language that can capture seanchas. So if you look up what does seanchas mean, it's the traditional law in Seanchas 4, collection of ancient law tracts, it's ancient history and tradition, it's genealogical information, it's lore, tradition, storytelling, Seanchas Baile, Seanchas Bale, Seanchas Nina, popular tradition, the rare Seanchas according to tradition. So it's the act of talking, chatting, seeking information, informative talk, discussion, interviews, formal and informal, exploral letters, memorial cards, stories, anecdotes, pitch-ups, patrilineal naming convention, Tommy Jack White. 3 generations in 3 words. Very important because it'll fill in gaps for you. Who visited who and why? I found that my parents and grandparents, so I thought it was these people that used to come to the house. Who are these randoms? Of course, they weren't randoms. They were cousins keeping in touch. And it was only years afterwards, I was saying, when my mother would visit Clonbur, she had a pecking order. I mean, her first cousin was number 1, her other first cousin was number 2. So literally, I would actually bring her around and she'd and she'd say, off with you now, and come back for me in a few hours, because I wouldn't want you overhearing my conversation with Peggy or Nappy or Sarah or whoever. So basically, very important to make notes about who people visited, because I say, in that generation, in my view, it wasn't random. And I've learned an awful lot from trying to interpret that. So there's no single word or phrase in the Irish language that comprehends seanchas, but it's how you will learn an awful lot about your community, your past. Sources and resources, I mean, there's a lot of it available now, thankfully, online. Some of it is, we have some academics here. Academics just don't like to use the word Wikipedia, so I haven't put Wikipedia in here. I was external examiner one time in University of Limerick, and there was an exam board meeting on, and someone of the examiners mentioned Wikipedia. All the heads looked immediately like this was who brought in something on their shoe. So, but Wikipedia is improving. It's not as bad as it's made out to people. There's a lot of stuff. Loganim is great because if you want to know the history of something, it'll trace the naming. I should have said at the start. My knowledge of this route, mainly taking a bypass from Clare Galway to Headford to cut out Galway City. And every time I'd come to Annaghdown or Annaghdown, I'd always think of Rachtra and thinking, you know, I don't know the lines anymore. His father's best, what is Tractor made the ball who was Annaghdown. I can't remember it. I learned it as a child. I know Mr. Rachtra and Philip, but I've forgotten most of Annaghdown. But that's every time I passed away, I think I'm going to have to go back and read it and remember it. It tends to come back fairly quickly. So that's it. Go mila mila mahibi and questions.